A 10-year-old girl is arrested by a police officer for no reason. She's scared and confused, not knowing what's going on. But just a few minutes later, something happens that no one expects. What happens next will shock you. Before we start the story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. It was a regular Tuesday afternoon in the small suburban town of Clearwater, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and life seemed to move at its own slow, peaceful pace. Maya, just 10 years old, was walking home from school, her backpack bouncing lightly with each step. She smiled, humming a little tune to herself as she passed by the familiar houses, the sun shining down and the birds chirping overhead. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In her world, there was no reason to expect anything but the usual, until the sirens broke through the calm. Without warning, a police car sped around the corner, its lights flashing and sirens blaring. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She froze for a second, unsure if the noise was even for her. It wasn't. The officer didn't seem to be in a rush. The car came to a slow stop right beside her. The window rolled down, and Maya looked up into the stern face of Officer Thompson, a figure she'd seen around town more than a few times. He wasn't someone she knew well, but she'd heard the whispers. He had a reputation, and not a good one. A reputation for being harsh, for being quick to judge, and for treating people differently, depending on who they were. He had a look in his eyes today, though, that made her feel uneasy, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. "Hey, you there!" he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "What are you doing walking around here by yourself?" Maya flinched at his tone. She'd been walking home alone for years. It was nothing unusual in her neighborhood, but the officer's eyes seemed to pierce through her, sizing her up in a way that made her skin crawl. Before she could respond, he was already stepping out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a hard thud. "I said, what are you doing here?" he repeated, taking a few steps toward her. His face twisted into something cold, something that didn't belong on the face of an officer of the law. Maya opened her mouth to explain, but words caught in her throat. She hadn't done anything. She was just walking home, like always. But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed as he approached, his hand reaching out to grab her arm with a grip that felt too tight for comfort. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" he growled. Maya's mind raced. She had no idea what he was talking about. "I'm calling this in. You're under arrest for suspicious activity." The words felt like a punch in her stomach. "But I didn't do anything," she wanted to scream, but they were stuck behind the knot in her throat. The officer wasn't listening. He was already pulling out his handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the sunlight as he forced her hands behind her back. The whole world seemed to freeze around her. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The people who had been walking by just moments ago were now stopping, turning their heads in curiosity. Some stared, some kept walking, not wanting to get involved. A couple of people pulled out their phones, quietly filming the scene. But no one stepped in. No one challenged the officer, even as he yelled at Maya to stop resisting, even though she wasn't doing anything but standing there, confused and scared. Her mind was racing, but her body was paralyzed, trapped in a moment she couldn't control. The officer's harsh grip pulled her toward the squad car, his voice laced with disgust as he muttered under his breath, "You think you can get away with this, huh?" Maya's chest tightened, her hands now secured painfully behind her. She looked around, hoping someone would help, but the crowd only stared, some shaking their heads, others too afraid to step forward. What had she done to deserve this? Why was this happening to her? As the officer shoved Maya into the back of his squad car, she could feel her stomach twisting into knots. The cold metal seat felt harsh against her skin, and the world outside the window seemed to blur into nothing. All she could focus on was the heavy silence that hung in the air, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the officer's muttered complaints as he slammed the door shut. Her mind was spinning. She didn't understand any of this. The cop hadn't said what she'd done wrong, and no one seemed to care that she was a kid. just a little girl, barely past the age of 10. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but the more she thought about what was happening, the more it felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Inside the car, everything felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the officer in the front seat didn't seem to be in any rush. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, his knuckles white. He was muttering to himself, too quietly for Maya to make out the words, but the anger in his voice was clear. She could feel the weight of his hatred in the way he glared at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Maya wasn't the only one who had noticed the officer's attitude. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered. People had started to talk among themselves, their voices a mix of concern and confusion. Some were pulling out their phones, capturing the moment, while others simply stood there, too afraid to speak up. Everyone knew about Officer Thompson. They knew his temper. They knew how he treated people. But no one ever said anything. People didn't want to get involved. A young woman in the crowd, about the same age as Maya's older sister, looked at the officer with visible disgust. She had seen this before, seen the way Officer Thompson always seemed to pick out certain people, the ones who didn't look like him, the ones who didn't fit into his narrow view of who belonged and who didn't. It made her sick. But what could she do? What could anyone do? The system was too big, too powerful, and she was just a bystander. The young woman took a step forward, hesitating for a moment, and then pulled out her phone. Her hands shook slightly as she started filming. "I'm recording this," she said loudly enough for the officer to hear. "This isn't right." But the officer didn't even look her way. His focus remained solely on the girl in the back of the car. As the officer's patrol car slowly rolled down the street, Maya sat there, staring blankly out the window. She didn't know where they were going, but she had a sinking feeling that it didn't matter. She had no idea how long she'd been sitting there. Minutes. Hours. It felt like time had stopped, like her entire life was on pause. All she wanted was to go home, to forget this whole horrible thing had ever happened. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just going to go away. Something told her this was just the beginning. And in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered, "This isn't over." The car came to a slow stop in front of the police station, the tires screeching against the asphalt as Officer Thompson shifted the vehicle into park. The engine hummed for a moment before falling silent, and the weight of the moment settled in Maya's chest. She couldn't believe it. She was about to be taken into a police station, like she was some kind of criminal. The door to the squad car opened with a squeal, and before she could even think, the officer was standing there pulling her roughly by the arm. Maya winced at the pain in her wrist as he yanked her out of the car, her legs weak beneath her. She was still in shock, unsure of what was happening, or what would happen next. The station loomed in front of her, its tall brick walls giving off an intimidating aura, like it was a place where only the guilty were meant to go. She was marched inside, her heart pounding in her ears. The cool air inside the building did nothing to calm her nerves. If anything, it made her feel even more exposed. The walls were lined with dark wooden panels, and the floor was cold and sterile. As they passed through a long hallway, Maya could hear muffled voices from behind closed doors, discussions, arguments, and the occasional loud thud of a door slamming. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. The officer walked with his chest puffed out, his pace unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. Maya was barely keeping up, her mind still racing with confusion. She tried to speak, tried to find her voice, but every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck, choked by the fear that had taken over her. "Why are you doing this?" Maya asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Thompson didn't even spare her a glance. He kept his eyes forward, a hard line etched across his face. "You don't need to understand, kid. Just keep walking." They reached a small holding area in the back, where Maya was told to sit down. A metal bench sat against the wall, cold and unforgiving. Maya sat down gingerly, still rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had left marks. She didn't know how long she was going to be there, or what was going to happen next. Her thoughts kept spiraling. She was scared, confused, and completely alone. A few minutes passed before the door opened again. Another officer walked in, a woman this time with short, dark hair and a stern but calm expression. Maya looked up at her, searching for some sign of kindness, some hint that this was all just a mistake. The woman didn't say anything right away, but her eyes flicked to the file in her hand, then to Officer Thompson, who stood by the door, arms crossed. The tension in the room thickened as the woman took a step forward, her gaze now locked on Maya. There was something in her eyes, something that made Maya feel like she wasn't completely alone in this. "What's your name, kid?" the woman asked gently, her voice a stark contrast to the harsh tone of Officer Thompson. "Maya," she replied, her voice trembling. "Maya Harris." The woman nodded, making a quick note on the paper she was holding. "Maya, I'm Officer Lopez. I'm going to make sure you're okay, all right? I'll need you to stay here for a little while, but I'll be back to check on you." Maya nodded, unsure of what to say. She wanted to ask her why this was happening, but she couldn't get the words out. Instead, she just sat there, trying to process everything. The officer, the arrest, the confusion, and wondering if anyone would be able to fix this. As Officer Lopez turned to leave, Officer Thompson, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice sharp and commanding. "She's just a kid. She'll be out of here soon enough," he said, his tone carrying an almost dismissive note. Maya didn't understand why his words made her feel even more vulnerable, like she didn't matter to him at all. But just as Officer Lopez was about to exit the room, something changed. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a heavy weight had lifted just slightly. The door to the hallway opened, and in walked another officer. This one wasn't familiar to Maya, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made Maya pause. This officer, slightly older, but not much, moved with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the room quickly before they landed on Officer Thompson. There was no fanfare, no introduction. She simply stood there for a second, her presence commanding the room, and it was clear from the way she looked at Officer Thompson that something was about to change. The officer's gaze flicked over to Maya, then back to Thompson. Maya couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a sense of authority in this new officer's stance that made the tension in the room palpable. And in that brief moment, Maya knew one thing for sure. What was happening to her wasn't going to go unnoticed for much longer. Something was about to shift, and it wouldn't be in Officer Thompson's favor. Officer Lopez glanced over at the new arrival, a flicker of recognition passing between them. It was clear to Maya that something was happening, something she didn't fully understand, but it felt like things were finally starting to move in her favor. Officer Lopez seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she took in the presence of the newcomer. The new officer took another step into the room, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Thompson," she said, her words almost measured, "I need to speak with you now." Maya watched as the two officers exchanged a quick, unreadable look. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, the air thick with unspoken tension. Officer Thompson didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his arms crossed, staring down at the floor like he was trying to gather his thoughts. But the longer the silence stretched, the more the sense of discomfort in the room grew. "Now," the officer repeated, her voice holding a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. The intensity in her tone seemed to make Officer Thompson uncomfortable, and he finally took a step back, reluctantly moving toward the door. As he passed, he gave Maya a glance, brief, almost dismissive, but it was enough to make her stomach twist. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Maya alone in the small room with Officer Lopez. Maya couldn't help but notice that this officer seemed different. Lopez didn't look at her with the same kind of coldness Officer Thompson had shown. Instead, Lopez's gaze was steady, compassionate. It was the kind of look that made Maya feel like she wasn't just a problem to be solved, but a person who mattered. For a long moment, Maya sat still, unsure of what was going to happen next. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. She was still terrified. How could she not be? She had been dragged from the street like a criminal, and now she was stuck in a cold room, waiting for answers. But there was something about Officer Lopez that gave her a sliver of hope. Finally, Officer Lopez broke the silence. "Maya," she began, her voice softer now. "I'm going to ask you a few questions. I need you to answer honestly, okay?" Maya nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what was going on. What kind of questions could she possibly have? Why was she being treated like this? Officer Lopez moved to sit across from Maya, folding her arms in front of her and looking at her with a level gaze. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her tone kind but direct. Maya shook her head, her throat tightening again. I don't know. I was just walking home. The officer, he just stopped me and said I was being arrested. He didn't tell me why." Lopez looked down at the file in her hands for a moment before returning her gaze to Maya. "I know you're scared," she said softly, "and I know you're confused, but you're not the one who needs to be worried right now." Maya blinked, not quite understanding what she meant. What did that mean? Wasn't she the one who had been arrested? Wasn't she the one who was stuck in this station, unsure of what was going to happen to her? Lopez continued, her voice steady. "The officer who brought you in, Officer Thompson, he's been under investigation, and what he did to you today, it's part of a pattern we've been looking into." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Officer Thompson was under investigation? Had he done this to other people before? She didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more frightened. Lopez's expression softened slightly as she saw the confusion in Maya's eyes. "I know this is a lot for you to understand, but trust me when I say we're going to get to the bottom of this. You're not alone." Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what was happening, but words failed her. She just nodded, unsure of what else to do. Before Lopez could say anything more, the door to the room opened again, and this time, Officer Thompson stepped back inside, his face ashen, his jaw tight. He looked like a man who had just been confronted with something he couldn't ignore. The tension between him and Officer Lopez was palpable, and Maya could sense the shift in the air. Something had changed, and she wasn't sure exactly what it was. But it was clear that whatever was going on, it wasn't good for Officer Thompson. Lopez didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're done here, Thompson," she said, her tone sharp, her gaze never leaving him. "We've got enough to move forward with an official investigation. You're being taken off the street." Officer Thompson's face reddened as he stepped back, his hand reaching for his radio. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but there was no bravado in his voice now, no confidence. Whatever grip he had over the situation was slipping away. Maya watched, wide-eyed, as Lopez moved toward the door and spoke into her radio. "I need backup now. Bring him in. He's under arrest for misconduct." A strange sense of calm washed over Maya as she realized what was happening. The officer who had hurt her, who had treated her like she didn't matter, was about to face the consequences of his actions. The idea seemed unreal, almost like something out of a movie, but it was happening right before her eyes. Officer Thompson, the man who had wrongfully arrested her, was finally going to be held accountable. And for the first time since this nightmare had started, Maya felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could still be set right. The tension in the room was palpable as Officer Thompson stood there, his face growing darker with every passing second. He tried to hide the panic in his eyes, but it was clear he wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of this kind of attention. Officer Lopez stood firm, unwavering, while Thompson continued to fume under his breath. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. The door behind him opened, and two other officers entered the room, one male, one female. They didn't say a word to Maya, nor did they look at her. Their focus was entirely on Officer Thompson. The male officer moved toward Thompson with a determined step, his hand outstretched to relieve him of his radio and badge. Thompson stiffened, his lips pressed together in a thin line as the officer spoke. "Officer Thompson," the male officer said with authority, his voice even. "You're being placed under arrest for misconduct and abuse of power. You've been investigated for excessive force and inappropriate behavior. You'll be taken into custody for questioning." Thompson's face turned pale, his earlier bravado crumbling. His mouth opened as if to argue, but the words never came. Instead, he stood there, frozen, as the female officer took his handcuffs from his belt and snapped them around his wrists. There was no struggle, no resistance. It was as if he knew, deep down, that there was no escaping what was about to happen. The officers moved quickly and efficiently, not giving him any chance to protest or fight back. Maya watched the entire scene unfold, her heart beating faster. She hadn't expected this. She didn't know what to expect, really. The idea that Officer Thompson, the same man who had arrested her without cause, was now the one being arrested, was almost surreal. But it wasn't over. The shock of seeing the officer in cuffs was quickly replaced with something deeper. Something that felt like justice, like the world was finally beginning to right itself. Officer Lopez didn't take her eyes off of Thompson as he was led out of the room. She stepped closer to Maya, her expression softening just a little. "I know this has been difficult," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that you were right. You didn't deserve any of this." Maya could barely find her voice. She still felt the weight of the handcuffs around her wrists, the fear that had gripped her chest earlier. But hearing Officer Lopez speak like that made her feel for the first time like maybe she wasn't the problem. Is he going to be okay?" Maya asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lopez gave a small, reassuring nod. "He won't be able to hurt anyone else like this again, and I'm going to make sure you get home safe. You don't have to worry about him anymore." Maya's breath caught in her throat, the tension in her body starting to release, if only a little. Officer Lopez's words gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt all day. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Maya sat there staring at the spot on the floor where Officer Thompson had been standing just moments before. Everything around her seemed to blur, as if the world was slowly returning to focus. The officers had left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She was still processing what had just happened, how she had gone from being a scared, confused child dragged into a police station to witnessing the arrest of the officer who had hurt her. It felt like everything had shifted in an instant, like the world had suddenly tilted on its axis and turned things right again. But Maya knew that things weren't always as simple as they seemed. She still had so many questions, so many things she didn't understand. The world of grown-ups, especially the world of police officers and authority figures, was so much more complicated than she had ever realized. A few minutes later, Officer Lopez returned, this time with a gentler expression. She walked toward Maya, her movements calm and purposeful. "Maya," Lopez said softly, "I'm going to take you home now. You've been through a lot today, but it's over. Officer Thompson is in custody and he's going to face the consequences for what he did to you. I know this was hard, but I need you to understand that you didn't do anything wrong. He's the one who messed up." Maya nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't sure how to feel. She was relieved, yes, but there was still a knot in her chest, a heaviness that hadn't fully lifted. She had been scared for so long, unsure of what was going to happen to her. But now she could feel that sense of fear starting to fade, replaced by something that felt like justice? Maybe. Lopez smiled reassuringly as she motioned for Maya to stand up. "Come on, let's get you out of here. I'll make sure you're safe." Maya stood up slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She didn't say anything at first, but as she walked toward the door, she felt a strange sense of empowerment she hadn't expected. A small victory had been won today, not just for her, but for everyone who had been unfairly treated. And even though the road ahead would still have its challenges, Maya knew that sometimes, even in the face of injustice, things could still be set right. As they walked out of the room and into the hallway, the soft sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet police station. Maya took a deep breath, ready to finally leave this place behind. For the first time since everything had started, she wasn't just the scared little girl. She was someone who had stood up to wrong, and in the end, justice had found its way. The ride home was a blur. Officer Lopez's car hummed steadily along the road, and Maya stared out the window, the familiar streets of her neighborhood passing by in a wash of color. Everything felt so different now. The world outside seemed just a little brighter, like the sun had finally broken through the clouds. But inside, Maya's mind was still whirling. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment when Officer Thompson had been arrested, his face twisted in disbelief. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't said a word. It was as if he had known all along that the walls were closing in on him. Maya's heart pounded again as she replayed the events in her mind. She couldn't wrap her head around the fact that someone who had hurt her was now the one facing the consequences. For so long she had been scared, not just of the officer but of the whole system that seemed so big, so powerful. It had always felt like no one would believe her, like no one would care. But today had proven otherwise. Officer Lopez glanced over at her, sensing her silence. "How are you holding up, Maya?" she asked gently, her voice kind but still firm, like a constant source of stability. Maya shifted in her seat, pulling her knees up close to her chest. "I'm okay, I guess," she answered slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, everything happened so fast. One minute I'm walking home, and the next, I don't know. I don't even understand how all this could happen to me." Lopez nodded, her eyes focused on the road ahead. "I know it's a lot to process, but I need you to remember something. What happened to you wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve any of it." Maya stayed quiet for a moment, letting those words sink in. She'd heard similar things before, but today they felt different. Today they felt real. Lopez wasn't just telling her things to make her feel better. She was telling her the truth. As they approached Maya's street, she could see her house in the distance. It was a small house, nothing special, but it was home. Her heart skipped a beat as they pulled into the driveway, the front door still closed, just like she'd left it that morning. For a second, everything seemed normal again. The events of the day felt like they had happened to someone else, as if the whole ordeal had been a strange dream. But Maya knew better. She knew what had happened was real, and she would never forget it. As they parked in front of her house, Maya felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. She was glad to be home, but she knew this moment wasn't over. The world might look normal again on the outside, but things had changed inside her. She had been through something no child should have to experience, and she would carry that with her. The weight of the day was still heavy on her shoulders, but now it felt like she wasn't carrying it alone. Officer Lopez turned off the engine and turned to face Maya. "You're safe now," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I'm going to make sure you're okay. We'll be following up with your parents soon, and if you need anything, you just call me. I'm always here to help." Maya nodded, her throat tight as she tried to find the words. "Thank you," she finally whispered. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't helped me." Lopez gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me, Maya. You did the hard part. You stood up for yourself, and that's something to be proud of." As Maya opened the car door and stepped out onto the driveway, she felt a rush of emotions. Her legs were a little shaky, and her hands still felt cold from the handcuffs. But there was also something else, something stronger. She felt like she had just crossed a line she never thought she would cross. For the first time today, she wasn't just the victim in this story. She had fought back, and she had won. She turned to look at Officer Lopez one last time before walking to the front door. Lopez smiled at her, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "Take care of yourself, Maya. I'll be checking in soon. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything, okay?" "I will," Maya said, her voice steady now, more sure of herself than she had been all day. As the car drove off, Maya stood for a moment on the porch, staring at the house in front of her. It was hard to shake the feeling that something had shifted today, not just in her but in the world around her. Maya had faced something dark, something terrifying, but she had come out the other side stronger than she could have imagined. Inside, her mom was waiting. She had no idea what had just happened, but Maya was ready to tell her, ready to share everything. But for now, she just took a deep breath, walking inside with her head a little higher, her heart a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the world might just be a little bit safer. Maya stepped inside her house, the familiar smell of dinner wafting from the kitchen, but it didn't offer her the comfort it usually did. Her mom, who had been standing by the stove, froze when she saw her. Her face immediately softened, eyes scanning Maya for any signs of distress. "Maya? What's going on?" Her mom's voice was full of concern, her hand wiping the flour from her apron as she took a step forward. "What happened? Why are you so late? Where's the officer?" Maya didn't answer right away. She closed the door behind her, taking a deep breath, trying to find the words to explain everything. The tension in her chest was still there, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. But there was also something else now, a strange kind of calm that came from knowing the worst had passed. She wasn't sure where to begin, but her mom was waiting, her eyes filled with worry, and Maya knew she needed to speak. "Mama, I got stopped by a cop," she began, her voice shaky but steady. Her mom's eyebrows shot up and her mouth opened, but Maya rushed ahead, wanting to get it all out before the questions came. "I don't know why, but he said I was being arrested. He didn't tell me why, but he put me in handcuffs and took me to the police station." Her mom's face shifted, disbelief and anger flashing across it. "What?" she gasped, taking a step closer to Maya. "He arrested you? A 10-year-old? Maya, what?" "I didn't do anything," Maya interrupted, the words spilling out of her. "I swear I was just walking home and he just grabbed me. He said I was doing something wrong, but I wasn't. I don't know what happened. But it wasn't just me, Mama. It wasn't just me." Her mom was silent for a moment, her face going pale as she absorbed the weight of what Maya was saying. Then, slowly, her expression softened, her voice quieter but stronger. "You're okay now though, right? What happened to the officer?" Maya hesitated for a second, unsure of how to explain everything that had happened in the police station. He got arrested," she said finally. "He's under investigation, and they said he did this before. They put him in handcuffs and took him away. It's over now, Mama. He's not going to hurt anyone else." Her mom blinked as if trying to process everything. The silence in the room felt heavy, like there was so much more to say, but neither of them had the words yet. Maya's mom stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a tight embrace, her hands trembling slightly. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. You didn't deserve any of that." Maya hugged her back, squeezing her eyes shut as she fought to hold back tears. It was overwhelming. The fear, the uncertainty, and now the relief. She felt like she had lived a lifetime in just a few short hours. But there was something else, something deeper, that was starting to sink in. She hadn't just been a victim today. She had been brave. She had stood up for herself, even when everything seemed stacked against her. And for the first time since everything had started, she realized she wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't just going to let fear take over her life. As Maya sat down at the kitchen table with her mom, the evening settled into a quiet routine, though the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. The smell of dinner that had once felt comforting now felt distant, almost surreal. Maya's mom had set a plate in front of her, but Maya wasn't really hungry. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the police station, to Officer Thompson's arrest, and to the strange sense of empowerment that had come over her in that moment. Her mom didn't push her to talk anymore, sensing that Maya needed some space. Instead, she quietly sat across from her, watching as Maya picked at her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. It wasn't until the clock on the wall ticked past 8 p.m. that Maya's mom spoke again. "You know," her mom began, her voice quieter than usual, "what happened today doesn't just go away. People will hear about it, Maya. Your story, the way that officer treated you, it won't be forgotten." Maya looked up at her mom, feeling a sudden surge of emotions. "But what if it doesn't matter?" she asked, her voice small. "What if no one believes me? What if people just forget about it?" Her mom leaned forward, taking Maya's hands in hers, and looking her right in the eyes. "Maya," she said softly but firmly, "this matters. You matter. The truth matters. And you did something so important today. You spoke up. You made sure that officer couldn't hurt anyone else. That's powerful. People will listen, and they'll see you for who you really are. A brave, strong young girl who stood up when it counted." Maya stared at her mom for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. Her words were heavy, but they were also filled with something that felt like hope. Her mom wasn't just comforting her. She was showing her that this story, her story, was important. It wasn't just a mistake or an accident. It was a moment of truth, of justice. Maya wasn't just a kid who had been wronged. She was someone who had made a difference. The quiet in the room wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful. And in that moment, Maya realized that the fear she had carried with her for so long was starting to fade. The courage she had found inside herself was something no one could take away. The night went on like this, slow, quiet, but full of new understanding. Maya didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what would happen next, but for the first time she felt like she had a voice, and that voice wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Maya woke up early, her mind racing even before her feet touched the floor. The sun was barely rising, but the events of yesterday played in her head like a loop. The images of Officer Thompson's arrest flashing in her mind every few seconds. It felt surreal, like the whole thing had been a dream. But then she'd wake up in the morning and remember, it wasn't a dream. It was real. And it had changed everything. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, taking slow breaths, trying to shake off the lingering unease. She hadn't realized until now just how much fear had taken root inside her. Yesterday she had been scared, unsure, uncertain of what would happen next. But today it was different. The fear was still there, but it was quieter, less overwhelming. She had faced something bigger than herself and come out the other side. Maya stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The houses were still and peaceful, the morning air crisp and clean. The world seemed unchanged on the surface, but Maya knew it wasn't. Everything had shifted inside her. She wasn't the same girl who had walked home from school the day before. She wasn't the same girl who had been grabbed by a cop, cuffed, and shoved into the back of a police car. She wasn't even the same girl who had sat in that cold holding room, feeling lost and alone. She was different now. Her mom knocked softly on her door before opening it. "You okay, baby?" she asked gently, stepping into the room. Maya turned around, offering a small smile. "Yeah, I think so." Her mom walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything today if you don't want to," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've been through enough already. I'm here for you no matter what." Maya thought for a moment. She could stay in today, bury herself under the covers, try to forget it all. But that wasn't what she needed. What she needed was to face it head on. She needed to be strong. Strong for herself, for others, for everyone who had ever been treated like she had been. This wasn't just her story. It was a story that needed to be told. "I'm okay, Mama," Maya said, her voice steady. "I want to do something today. I want to tell my story." Her mom's eyes softened, a mixture of pride and concern in them. "Are you sure, sweetheart? It's not going to be easy. People might ask questions and it might be tough to talk about." Maya nodded, her jaw setting in determination. I can't stay quiet. I need people to know what happened. What he did wasn't right." Her mom smiled warmly, her hand gently squeezing Maya's shoulder. "Then we'll do it together. Whatever you need, I'm with you every step of the way." Maya's first step was to reach out to her school. She had been thinking about it all morning, how to say the words, how to explain to them what had happened. She wasn't sure exactly what would come of it, but she knew she couldn't just sit on the sidelines anymore. Her voice, shaky as it might be, needed to be heard. So, with her mom's encouragement, she made the call. The school receptionist picked up after the second ring. "Good morning, Clearwater Elementary. How can I help you?" "Hi, this is Maya Harris," Maya said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I wanted to speak to my principal, Ms. Turner. It's about something that happened to me yesterday." There was a brief pause and Maya's heart raced as she waited for the response. She wasn't sure if they would take her seriously or just brush it off, but the receptionist didn't hesitate. "Of course, Maya, let me put you through to her." A moment later, the phone clicked, and Maya heard Ms. Turner's familiar voice. "Maya, good morning. How are you doing? I heard from your mom that something happened yesterday. Are you all right?" Maya took a deep breath. This was it. She had to say it. "Ms. Turner," she began, her voice clear but still a little shaky. "I was stopped by a police officer on my way home from school. He arrested me, even though I didn't do anything wrong. He was really rough with me and he didn't tell me why I was being arrested. I just want you to know, and I think other people should know too." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Maya held her breath, feeling the weight of the words she had just spoken. She wasn't sure what kind of response she was expecting, but she hadn't prepared for the quiet that stretched between them. Then, finally, Ms. Turner spoke. "Maya," she said, her voice soft but full of concern, "I am so sorry that this happened to you. That should never have been the case. Thank you for being brave enough to tell me. I'm going to make sure we get to the bottom of this, and I'll be in touch with the police department. You've done the right thing by speaking up." Maya nodded, even though she knew Ms. Turner couldn't see her. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice steady now. "I just don't want it to happen to anyone else." "You've done more than enough, Maya," Ms. Turner replied. "You're a brave young girl. We'll make sure your voice is heard." As the call ended, Maya set the phone down with a sense of relief. She hadn't known how it would go, but it felt good to have spoken up. She had taken the first step toward turning this nightmare into something bigger, something that could help others. And as she looked over at her mom, who was watching her with a proud smile, Maya knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't going to let her story fade into the background. It was time for change, and she was going to be a part of it. The rest of the day passed in a quiet blur. After the phone call with Ms. Turner, Maya spent the next few hours talking with her mom about what had happened, about how the school would handle things, and about the police officer's arrest. It felt like a relief to finally be able to share it all, her fears, her confusion, and the anger she had been holding inside. Her mom was her rock, listening without judgment and offering her steady reassurance. But as much as Maya appreciated her mom's support, there was a growing sense of responsibility inside her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, or because they didn't fit some narrow definition of what was acceptable. Maya wasn't just telling her story to get sympathy. She was telling it because, for once, someone needed to stand up and say it wasn't okay. Maya grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as she thought about how to put it into words. It felt like a small step, but it was the right one. She decided to post on her social media. Just a simple message, something for her friends, for her community, for anyone who needed to hear it. She typed out the words carefully. "Yesterday, I was arrested for no reason. I did nothing wrong. The officer who stopped me didn't explain anything, didn't listen, and hurt me in a way I can't forget. But I'm speaking out today because this can't keep happening to anyone. We have to stand up for what's right. We have to make sure this stops. I won't be quiet about it. I won't let this be forgotten." She read the words over again, making sure they said exactly what she wanted to say. She wasn't sure what the response would be. She didn't know if people would understand or even care. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was using her voice. Her story was hers, and no one could take that away from her. Maya hit post, and as soon as she did, a rush of emotions flooded her chest. The nerves, the fear of being judged, of not being believed, it all mixed together. But beneath it all, she felt something else. Something stronger. A sense of purpose. a sense of power that came from standing up for herself and what was right. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. At first, it was just a few likes and comments from her friends, telling her how brave she was, how sorry they were for what had happened. But then, as the minutes passed, the comments started to pour in from people she didn't even know. Her post was being shared. People were reading her story. People were listening. The flood of support brought tears to her eyes. It wasn't just that people were validating her feelings. It was that people cared. People believed her. People wanted change, just like she did. Later that evening, the phone rang again. Maya was in her room, scrolling through the growing list of messages when she heard her mom calling her from downstairs. "Maya, there's someone on the phone for you. It's a reporter from the local news." Maya froze. A reporter? She hadn't expected this. She'd only shared her story to her friends and family, never imagining that it would catch the attention of anyone outside of her immediate circle. She stood up slowly, walking down the stairs, her mind racing. What would they ask her? Was she ready to talk to a reporter? She had already shared her story online, but now this felt different, bigger. Her mom was sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand. "It's for you, sweetie," she said with a nod, her expression soft but filled with a mix of pride and concern. Maya took a deep breath as she grabbed the phone, her fingers feeling a little shaky as she pressed it to her ear. "Hello," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Hi, is this Maya Harris?" came the voice on the other end. It was calm, professional, but Maya could hear the hint of curiosity in the reporter's tone. "Yes, this is Maya," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hi, Maya. My name is Jennifer from Clearwater News. We've been following your story, and I wanted to reach out to you directly. We're doing a piece about what happened with Officer Thompson, and we'd really like to hear your side of things. We believe your story could help raise awareness about police misconduct and the need for change in our community." Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. This was bigger. This was a chance to change something, to make sure no one else had to face what she had faced. I'm ready to talk," Maya said, her voice stronger now. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was standing up for something bigger than herself. Jennifer's voice softened. "I know this isn't easy, but your voice is powerful, Maya. And what you have to say matters." Maya nodded, even though the reporter couldn't see her. "Thank you for listening," she said. "I want people to know that this isn't right, and we have to do something about it." As she began to speak into the phone, her words flowed more easily than she had expected. She told Jennifer everything, about the arrest, about the fear, about the way Officer Thompson had treated her. She didn't hold back. She spoke with the truth in her heart and the strength she hadn't known she had until now. This wasn't just about a bad cop. This was about a system that needed to change, a system that needed to hear her voice. And for the first time, Maya realized that her story wasn't just hers to tell. It was for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had felt powerless. It was time for their voices to be heard too. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Maya found herself thrust into a new world, one she hadn't expected to be a part of. The story she had shared on social media had gone viral, spreading across her school, her town, and beyond. People were talking about it. People were paying attention. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from friends, classmates, and even strangers who had read her story. Some praised her courage, others shared similar experiences, but all of them echoed the same sentiment. Maya had done something important. But with the praise also came the questions, the interviews, the press conferences. Reporters were calling her, asking for interviews, trying to get her to speak on the record. Her story was making waves, and Maya could feel the weight of it. At first it felt overwhelming. This sudden attention, this sense of being at the center of something much bigger than herself. It was like the world had turned its focus onto her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for all of it. Still, Maya found strength in the words of her mom, Ms. Turner, and Officer Lopez. They had all told her that her story mattered. They had told her that speaking out was the right thing to do, that she wasn't just a victim, but a voice for change. And slowly, Maya started to believe that too. One evening, as Maya sat in the living room, scrolling through the latest news article about her, her mom came in and sat down beside her, offering a quiet smile. "You're doing great, sweetheart," her mom said, her voice gentle but full of pride. "I know it's a lot. I know it's not easy. But what you're doing is making a difference. You've already made a difference." Maya nodded, her eyes still focused on the screen, but her mind wasn't really there. It was racing ahead to the future, to what came next. The town was talking about the changes that needed to happen. The police department had promised an internal review of Officer Thompson's conduct, and several local organizations were planning to hold rallies and town hall meetings. People were mobilizing. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was the beginning of something bigger, a movement maybe, or at least the spark of change. "You know," Maya said, her voice quieter now, "I never thought anything like this would happen to me. I didn't think my story would be important. But now, I don't know. It feels like maybe, just maybe, this is how things can change." Her mom smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I'm so proud of you. Not just for sharing your story, but for standing up for what's right. That's how change happens, when people have the courage to speak up, even when it's hard." Maya sat back, her mind still spinning, but now filled with a sense of quiet confidence. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how long it would take for things to change, or if they ever would. But what she did know was that she had done something real. She had stood up, told the truth, and faced the consequences with courage. And no matter what happened next, she had the strength to keep going. In that moment, Maya realized that she wasn't just part of a story anymore. She was part of a larger conversation, a movement toward justice, fairness, and change. And no matter how long it took, she knew her voice would continue to be heard. Because sometimes, one voice is all it takes to start a revolution. Weeks passed, and though the buzz surrounding Maya's story began to settle, the ripple effect it caused only grew stronger. Local media continued to cover the investigation into Officer Thompson, and more voices began to join the conversation. Maya's story had sparked something in Clearwater, a movement, a recognition of the injustices that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Maya hadn't expected any of this when she posted her message online. She had never thought of herself as an activist, or as someone who could inspire change. But now, as she walked through the halls of her school, she felt the weight of her own strength. People greeted her with nods of respect. Some still offered words of sympathy, but many now saw her as something else, a symbol of courage, a reminder that standing up for what's right can lead to change. Ms. Turner had called a meeting with the school board, and Maya had been invited to speak at the next assembly. It felt strange, unreal even, to stand before her classmates and teachers, knowing that her words carried so much weight. But when the day finally came, Maya stood at the front of the auditorium, her hands slightly trembling but her voice steady. She spoke not just about what happened to her, but about the need for a community to come together, to listen to the voices that had been ignored for so long. She talked about fairness, about accountability, about how no one should ever feel powerless. As she spoke, she could see the faces of her classmates, some of them nodding in agreement, others deep in thought. There were even a few teachers who were taking notes. Maya didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. The conversation had started, and that was all that mattered. The school board promised to take action. They pledged to review their relationship with local law enforcement, and they would offer more workshops on race, bias, and community engagement. Maya had become part of the catalyst that was slowly changing the way things worked in Clearwater. Back at home, her mom had been just as supportive, but there was a quiet pride in her eyes that Maya noticed. They didn't talk about it much, but Maya knew her mom saw what she had done. It wasn't just about the officer being held accountable anymore. It wasn't just about her being brave enough to speak out. It was about the way Maya had inspired others to use their voices, to demand fairness, and to stand up for what was right. One evening after dinner, Maya sat on the porch looking out at the street. The night was peaceful, and the sky was a deep shade of indigo, dotted with stars. Her mom joined her, sitting down beside her and resting a hand on her shoulder. "You know," her mom said, her voice thoughtful, "sometimes change happens in big, loud ways. But other times it starts small. It starts with one person who's brave enough to speak up." Maya smiled, leaning back in her chair. "I didn't know I was that person," she said quietly. "You are," her mom replied, her voice warm with pride. "You always were." Maya sat in silence for a moment, taking in her mom's words. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew this. She had made a difference. She had faced something ugly, something terrifying, and she had turned it into something beautiful. Her story wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about the power of standing up, of refusing to let fear control her life, and of knowing that even one person can change the world. As the evening air cooled, Maya felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room, or the one who had all the answers. All she needed was to be herself, the girl who spoke out when it mattered, the girl who refused to be silenced. And for the first time in a long time, Maya knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Months passed, and while life slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Maya could feel the impact of everything that had happened still echoing in the community. The investigation into Officer Thompson had led to the discovery of other incidents of misconduct, and he was eventually dismissed from the police force. But the story didn't end there. In Clearwater, the conversation about systemic injustice, police accountability, and community trust had become a constant, open dialogue. And Maya, despite her initial hesitation, found herself at the center of it. She was invited to local town hall meetings, where she sat alongside leaders, activists, and experts, discussing ways to build bridges between the police and the community. Her story had become a powerful example of how a single voice could shine a light on what had long been ignored. The support she received from her school, from local organizations, and from the people in her town had shown her just how much power a person could hold when they were willing to stand up for what was right. But it wasn't all easy. With the attention also came a constant flood of opinions, some supportive but others harsh and full of criticism. There were people in the community who were uncomfortable with the idea of a young girl speaking out, especially when it involved issues as complex and charged as police misconduct. There were anonymous comments on social media calling her a troublemaker or accusing her of exaggerating what had happened. Some even said that she was just trying to get attention. Maya read some of the comments, but most of them bounced off her. She had learned early on that people who didn't understand her struggle, people who hadn't experienced what she had, weren't worth listening to. It was the people who supported her, the ones who recognized the importance of her actions, that mattered. And as the months passed, the negative voices grew quieter, drowned out by the overwhelming support from her community. Despite the ups and downs, Maya had changed. She had grown more confident in her voice and her ability to make a difference. She found herself standing in front of groups, not just at school assemblies, but also at public events, sharing her story and urging others to speak up. She was asked to participate in a community youth council, where she could work alongside others to create programs that would help bridge the gap between young people and law enforcement. The experience was humbling, but Maya was proud of the progress they were making. One Saturday afternoon, while she was out with her mom running errands, they passed the same street corner where it had all started. The place where she had been stopped by Officer Thompson, the place where her world had turned upside down. Maya stopped in her tracks, the memory flooding back. She looked around, taking in the quiet surroundings, the same houses, the same trees lining the streets. Everything was still, but the world around her felt different. Her mom noticed the pause and looked at her with a knowing smile. "You okay?" she asked gently. Maya nodded, though her emotions were mixed. "Yeah, I think I just..." needed to remember. They stood there for a moment, just looking at the corner. It felt like a lifetime ago, but in many ways it felt like it had just happened yesterday. That was the moment that had changed everything for Maya. That moment had set her on this path, this journey she never imagined she would take. And now, standing there, it all felt right. She had turned something painful into something powerful. She had used her voice to create a conversation, a movement that wouldn't just fade away. "I've learned a lot," Maya said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and reflection. "I've learned that it's okay to speak out, that what happened to me wasn't just my problem, it's everyone's problem, and when we all stand together we can change things." Her mom smiled, proud but not surprised. "I'm so proud of you, Maya. You've done more than I could ever have imagined." Maya smiled back, the weight of the past few months still present but no longer as heavy. She had found her voice, and now it was a voice that carried not just her story, but the stories of so many others. She knew her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. As they continued their walk, Maya felt a quiet sense of peace. It was a peace born from knowing that she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced. It wasn't about the recognition or the attention. It was about the change, about making sure that no one would ever have to face what she had faced without knowing that they too had the power to speak out. Maya had started something that would continue long after her story was no longer in the headlines. And that, she realized, was the true power of her journey. The story she had shared was just the beginning. It was a spark, and sparks had the power to ignite fires that could change the world. A year had passed since the day Maya had been stopped by Officer Thompson, since the day her world had been turned upside down. A lot had changed since then, both in her life and in Clearwater. Maya had become a symbol of courage and change, a reminder of the power of speaking up. Her name was known across town, not just because of the arrest, but because of the ripple effect she had created in her community. People were more aware now, more conscious, more willing to listen. But despite all the external changes, the rallies, the town meetings, the ongoing conversations about police reform, Maya's personal journey was something far deeper. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of finding strength in moments of vulnerability, and of realizing that her voice was not just her own, but belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. The weight of everything that had happened was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. Maya had found peace in the midst of the chaos, and now she was using her story to shape the future. One crisp autumn afternoon, Maya stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself as she buttoned up her jacket. She was getting ready for another community event, another chance to speak out, but this one felt different. This time, it wasn't just about sharing her story. It was about celebrating the progress that had been made and acknowledging how far they still had to go. The town had made strides, but Maya knew the fight wasn't over. Real change took time, and it took people who were willing to keep pushing, keep speaking, and keep challenging the system. Maya's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up to see a message from her mom. "I'm so proud of you. You're making a difference every day." Maya smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Her mom had always been there, standing beside her, supporting her through it all. It wasn't just the big moments that mattered. It was the everyday encouragement, the quiet belief in her that had kept Maya going. And now, as she stood on the cusp of something new, something bigger than she had ever imagined, Maya realized that it wasn't just about her. It was about the community, about the people who had joined her in her fight for justice, and the ones who had been inspired by her to find their own voices. She left the house, heading toward the community center where the rally would be held. The streets were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, friends, teachers, and even some strangers. It had been a while since Maya had seen so many people gathered in one place for this cause. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a collective sense of purpose. It felt like everyone had come together for the same reason, to keep fighting for a better future, to keep pushing for change. As she entered the community center, Maya was greeted by a few familiar faces. Ms. Turner, the principal, was standing near the stage, talking to a group of local leaders. Maya could see Officer Lopez across the room, speaking with some of the other law enforcement officials who had committed to working with the community to rebuild trust. Maya had never imagined that she would be standing in this space, a space where conversations about reform and unity were happening, where real action was being taken. But here she was, a part of something much bigger than she had ever dreamed. After a few moments, it was time to take the stage. Maya walked up to the microphone, her heart beating a little faster now. It wasn't nerves. She had spoken at enough events to know how to handle the spotlight, but there was a deep sense of responsibility in her chest. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about the people who had stood by her, the ones who had shared their stories, the ones who had been waiting for their voices to be heard. She was no longer just Maya Harris, the girl who had been wrongfully arrested. She was Maya Harris, the voice for change. The room fell quiet as she stepped up to the podium. Maya looked out at the crowd, her eyes meeting those of the people who had supported her, who had fought with her. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "A year ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here talking to all of you. I never thought my story would matter that much. I never thought one person's voice could change anything. But that's the thing about change. It starts with one person, one voice, one story." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "What happened to me was wrong. I didn't deserve it. But I'm not the only one who has ever been treated unfairly. There are so many people in our community, in our country, who have felt powerless, who have been silenced, ignored, or hurt. We can't let that continue. We can't stay quiet anymore." Maya's heart pounded as she continued, but the words came easily now. "We've made progress. Clearwater is changing. People are listening and they're taking action. But there's still more to do. There are still systems in place that treat people differently, that make some voices louder than others, and we can't stop fighting until everyone's voice is heard." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, a wave of applause began, building and growing as more people joined in. Maya felt a wave of emotion rise within her, but she kept speaking. "We've come so far, but we have to keep pushing," she said, her voice now stronger. "We can't stop here. We need to keep standing up, keep demanding accountability, and keep fighting for fairness, for everyone. And I'm proud to be here, proud to stand with all of you, to know that together we can make sure this never happens again." As Maya finished her speech, the applause was deafening. She looked around the room at the faces in the crowd, the people who had shown up to make a difference, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, tangible hope. She had done more than speak her truth. She had inspired others to speak theirs, and together they were starting something that couldn't be stopped. Walking off the stage, Maya was met by Ms. Turner, Officer Lopez, and her mom, who all gave her tight hugs, their pride evident in their eyes. "You did it, Maya," her mom whispered, squeezing her tightly. Maya smiled, her heart full. She had done it, and this was just the beginning. For the first time in a long time, Maya felt like the world was in motion, like the conversation was changing, like things were really starting to shift. She wasn't just the girl who had been wronged. She was the girl who had turned her pain into action, and she was just getting started. As the crowd dispersed, Maya stood for a moment, looking around at all the people who had gathered to listen, to fight, to stand together. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. But she also knew that as long as people like her were willing to speak out, willing to demand better, the world would keep changing. And with that, Maya knew she had found her place, not just in Clearwater, but in the world. It was a place where her voice mattered, and it always would. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.